Over the past few weeks, I've read numerous Captain America comics spanning different periods to grasp the core of his character, and I came across something very interesting. Depending on the era, Captain America symbolizes different concepts. There are times when his stories are full of patriotism and are closer to propaganda than to fiction. What would you expect from a character named Captain America? But you might be surprised that in other comics, the character is used to strongly criticize his own government. So over the years, the Captain has not only fought against German dictators and the threat of communism, but has also faced corruption within his own government. And to the idea that the United States is not always the savior of the world, but can sometimes also be the villain of the story. This is what makes Captain America a much more complex character than it seems at first glance. He's not just a soldier who follows orders, but someone who constantly questions what his country's true ideals are. During World War II, he symbolized patriotic heroism, but in Vietnam, he represented disillusionment and rebellion against the system. After September 11th, he symbolized the conflict between security and liberty. Each era redefines what the United States should be, and with it, what Captain America represents. But how has the character changed so much over the years? And in the end, what does he really represent? Today, we'll analyze the best stories from over 80 years of the character. In order to answer these questions, my name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and today we're going to take Captain America very, very seriously.
I, the Geek Monitor.
In the early 1940s, superheroes like Superman and Batman were extremely popular, generating substantial profits. This led many other companies to want to replicate this success, creating their own superheroes. One of those companies was called Timely Comics, which would later be known as Marvel, who commissioned two young talents to create a character that could rival Superman in sales. So writer Joe Simon and illustrator Jack Kirby began working on their new character. One that would be directly involved in World War II, would have Hitler himself as one of the antagonists, and would proudly wear his country's flag on his suit. That's how Captain America was born, but his early stories would be very different from what we know today, since it borrows many elements from comics that came before it. In his early appearances, Captain America has a secret identity as an army private alongside Bucky. This identity is seen as weaker by others, including his love interest Betsy Ross, and he is often assigned minor tasks like peeling potatoes. Bucky's character was created to serve the same role as Robin did for Batman, to have a character for the Captain to interact with so he wouldn't be limited to monologues. But the biggest inspiration came from a character that you likely don't know, one that emerged a few months before Captain America and is very similar. I'm referring to the SHIELD character from Archie Comics, a patriotic superhero who wore a flag-themed suit and used a shield similar to Captain America's in his debut. Timely had to change Captain's shield in issue 2 due to complaints indicating they had to stop using the original design. The Captain had his own comic from the start, unlike Superman or Batman, featuring 3 distinct adventures per issue, something that few superheroes had at that time. Another big difference is that Captain America, being immersed in World War II, told us very political stories from the beginning. But what's interesting is that even in these early comics, it managed to criticize certain elements of the army. For example, in this panel from the first issue of Captain America, a government official laments the loss of a plane, to which Steve Rogers responds, "What do I care about the plane? What about the men who died on it?" Later, Rogers is scolded by a superior and forced to retire. It was not common to criticize the army in these times. Even in these early stories, there was more to Captain America than met the eye. Looking at this cover, it's easy to think of Captain America as pro-American propaganda during World War II. But the real intention was to criticize the ideals of the Nazi Party, which is not the same thing. Especially when you find out that there were many sympathizers of that party in the United States at that time. Captain America's co-creator said Nazis held mass meetings at Madison Square Garden in the US. Captain America was created in that atmosphere as seen in the 2023 Captain America comic. Steve Rogers himself witnesses these kinds of meetings in his country and fights with some of the attendees who confuse patriotism with discrimination. This comic tells us that one of Steve Rogers' great motivations for enlisting was realizing that these dangerous ideas also existed within his own country. When Captain America was created, the United States had not yet entered World War II. However, its creators Jack Kirby and Joe Simon were 2 young Jews who witnessed the injustices being committed on the other side of the world. They feared the same would occur in their city. With this context, Captain America symbolizes the ideal vision of what the United States should represent. A shield that protects those who can't defend themselves, a defender of just causes. An ideal that history has shown is often unachieved. After World War II, superhero comics declined in popularity as readers turned to other genres like horror and sci-fi. So many superhero comics stopped being published. So much so that in the last issue of Captain America, Steve Rogers didn't even appear in his comic, which was cancelled in 1941. For 13 years, Captain America's stories were absent, but in 1953 the character was given a second chance. So a new comic titled Captain America, the Communist Smasher began to be published. One where Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes re-enlist in the army and fight communist spies infiltrating the United States. It was a total failure, which only lasted 3 issues, but the interesting thing here is how they tried to reinterpret the character. After World War II, the United States entered a period of anti-communist paranoia known as McCarthyism, driven by Senator Joseph McCarthy. Marvel's idea was if in the 40s Hitler was the enemy and Captain America's stories worked against him. Now that the enemy is communism, it should be the same, but it wasn't. Perhaps because this time the enemy was not as tangible as in World War II, or perhaps it's because during this time hundreds of people in the United States were accused of having communist sympathies without solid evidence, which led to layoffs, blacklists, and media trials. Something that does not align with the ideas of freedom that Captain America usually represents. So Captain America would have to go back to sleep for another 11 years. In 1964, a group of superheroes called the Avengers began to have their own comic. When, in issue number 4, they accidentally discovered the frozen body of Captain America, who had disappeared during World War II. This moment in Marvel Comics is one of my favorites, not only because it justifies Captain's 20-year absence from the stories, ignoring the anti-communist version as this comic fully reimagined the character. Now it was no longer about the story of a World War II soldier, but it tells us about a man out of his time, who struggles to adapt to a world of completely new ideas and wonders if his ideals are still relevant. Over the next decades, Captain America led different versions of the Avengers on various missions, even though he is not the most powerful hero of all. However, Tony Stark, Thor, and the others could always trust that the Sentinel of Liberty could guide them to victory and onto the right path. One of my favorite moments of Captain America as a leader, we see it in the Infinity Gauntlet comic where he leads an attack on Thanos. What does it matter? The Mad Titan wielding the Infinity Gauntlet gradually overpowers the heroes. However, Steve Rogers fiercely and fearlessly opposes him despite the power difference. Something that was masterfully adapted to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But his solo comics weren't as successful. They were considered a minor title due to low sales. This led the company to implement some changes, like giving him a new partner named Sam Wilson Falcon, who originally didn't have mechanical wings, but was simply good at fighting. And years later, he would carry the mantle of Captain America. Why wasn't it selling well? Does it have to do with the political era that was being lived? During that time, the United States had become involved in the Vietnam War, where it tried to stop the expansion of communism. However, unlike World War II, many people did not agree with a war they did not fully understand. Millions of young people were forcibly recruited, while images of the war broadcast on television fueled social discontent. Several pacifist movements emerged, criticizing the government, until they forced the troops to withdraw in 1973. Now, imagine how difficult it was at that time to market a character like Captain America. In the words of the writer Stephen Englehart, and you see this guy wearing the flag on his chest. We were all embarrassed. However, Englehart himself took care of fixing this. His plan was to make Captain America more critical than Captain America had ever been. He can't believe what he's seeing on television. An ad that defames him, saying he's a vigilante who beats up honest businessmen and doesn't represent American values. Who's behind this? The Committee to Restore America's Principles, a comic from 1971, is still relevant today. Captain America is wrongly accused of murder and must break the law to prove his innocence. In the process, he discovers that a secret organization called the Secret Empire, which also attacks minorities like mutants, is behind everything, implying that the leader was the then President Richard Nixon. Although not in the frame, Marvel asked Stephen Englehart if Nixon was the evil leader. Initially, he denied it, but after publication, he publicly admitted that it was true. The Committee to Regain America's Principles, Committee to Regain America's Principles, was a satirical take on the real committee to re-elect the president, which aimed to secure Nixon's re-election. Ironically, the acronym for this committee was CREEP. Disillusioned with his government, Steve Rogers abandons the Captain America mantle and temporarily becomes Nomad, a borderless hero. Later, he concludes that his government and people are distinct, so he resumes being Captain America. a hero who since then represents his own ideals and not those of his government. The sales of Captain America completely changed. People liked seeing Steve Rogers as a critical voice, while at the same time being someone who is proud to be American. Perhaps that's why some of his most iconic stories take place in difficult times. Following the tragic September 11th attacks, Marvel Comics addressed the issue in some of their publications. After all, many of the company's stories not only take place in the United States, but in New York. 2 months after the events, Marvel released a controversial Spider-Man story featuring Doctor Doom, Kingpin, and Magneto mourning a tragic event. Why has it been heavily criticized? It simplifies complex topics, which may be why. A year later, Captain America addressed the issue in the New Deal comic. The story opens with Steve Rogers in the ruins of 2001 attempting to save people and subsequently confronting another assault on America. But this is a story that addresses the issue much more deeply. The comic criticizes the war on terrorism in the months after September 2001, and Steve Rogers is forced to confront villains who do act badly. But they are also people affected by years of conflicts, many fueled by United States foreign policy. So, Captain America also confronts the idea that much of the world's violence is a consequence of the direct actions of his government. In this comic, we see Captain America disobey Nick Fury's orders on several occasions, as he is more concerned with saving lives, including those of some of his enemies, than serving as a tool of the government. Another comic that is a great example of this new stage of Captain's stories would come in 2006 with the Civil War comic. And here, let me ask you something. Do you think Captain America would be in favor of the use of fire? In the Civil War comic, a tragedy leads superheroes to choose sides when the government seeks to regulate metahumans. On one hand, Iron Man supports the regulation, while Captain America opposes it because he believes that registration is a violation of individual freedoms. The Superhuman Registration Act, which has multiple interpretations, takes inspiration from the United States of America Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, passed after September 11th, granted the government extensive surveillance powers for national security purposes. The captain would oppose citizen surveillance, but what if it went beyond that? His stance has also been seen as opposing gun registration or regulation in the US. Given that superheroes are walking instruments of destruction, we should question which freedoms the captain supports and which ones he does not. Where does he draw the line? Despite Steve's defense of individual freedoms, he also has a strong sense of responsibility and protecting the innocent. So he would probably understand that in the real world, lack of regulation has led to many tragedies. Also, it's important to note that you can't be free if you don't feel safe. In the Civil War comic, we see a Steve who distrusts his government just like many other versions of the character. In the end, he surrenders upon seeing the superhero war's negative impact. Which tells us that the question goes beyond freedom or security. It's about being aware of which freedoms we defend and how to ensure that these freedoms do not harm others. What do you think Captain America would think in the real world? This comic was also adapted to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but differently. The situation is simpler, as there are far fewer metahumans in this universe, and Captain America, in this case by rejecting the Sokovia Accords, he is choosing to trust his own team, but not all the potential metahumans that could be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But something I really like about the Captain America we saw with Chris Evans is that he perfectly balances these facets of the Captain that we see in the comics. Reminder, I'll be giving a talk about Superman's history on February 22nd in Mexico City. Check the link in the description for tickets. In other words, he feels like an optimistic hero, proud of his country and ideals. Simultaneously, films like The Winter Soldier critique matters such as domestic surveillance and granting excessive authority to the government. When Steve Rogers retired after the Endgame movie, would the next Captain America project continue to use the character as social criticism? In the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series, Zemo says that the concept of the super soldier is subtenacious. And at first you don't believe it, because we usually think of Captain America fighting German soldiers. But the series suggests there is some truth to this. Steve Rogers became an admired hero after receiving the super soldier serum, but other soldiers were not as fortunate. The series adapts the story of Isaiah Bradley, an African-American soldier who received the super soldier serum but was imprisoned and subjected to inhuman experiments, as depicted in the comic Red, White, and Black. When he was forced to go on a mission to destroy a laboratory where the Germans were experimenting on Jewish people, he realized that both his government and the Germans were using people considered lower class. Could the perfected super soldier serum be safely injected into someone like Steve Rogers? In the comic's conclusion, Steve discovers that the Super Soldier Project originated from Nazi ideology. Is it true that Captain America represents what the United States should be? Some interpret this based on values and ideals, while others interpret it in terms of physical appearance. Sam Wilson being chosen by Steve to be the new Captain America is a crucial point in the series, and But the government decides to go a more traditional route and choose John Walker, another soldier who also loves his country. In the plot, the serum's power corrupts him at one point. Likewise, Sam doubts his ability to be the same kind of symbol as Steve. He sees himself in Isaiah Bradley and fears people's rejection, not because he lacks the courage. But it turns out that a very important point in the comics is that anyone who embodies the values that America should have, in theory, could be Captain America. We can see this in comics like Captain America's United States, a story where Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson join forces to locate a network of underground heroes who carry the mantle of Captain America. They're committed to assisting their community through various means. Each represents a minority. One is queer, one is of African descent, and one is Native American. Each issue shows how these characters reinterpret the symbol of Captain America. The series sparked controversy upon release, as many were upset despite the introduction of new characters, because they feel that Captain America might also have to be linked to other characteristics. In the comic chosen, a less controversial example of this concept is seen when it is revealed that Steve Rogers is dying. And with his last strength, he joins a government program designed for him to be able to locate his successor telepathically. But instead of choosing a new captain, America ends up choosing something he calls a crowd. That is, different people from different contexts who precisely represent the values of the character courage, honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. From a soldier in Afghanistan to doctors, farmers, and rescuers. Another comic that was also very controversial, but for completely different reasons, was the story of Secret Empire. This image of Captain America saying "Hail Hydra" went viral a few years ago. In the Secret Empire comic, Steve Rogers, manipulated by the Cosmic Cube, joins Hydra. This unleashed a lot of criticism, but at the same time, it gives us room to reflect. The comic tells us about how dangerous a Captain America on the side of evil would be, which makes us think about how dangerous the country he represents can become. Throughout history, the US has invaded foreign lands claiming to promote freedom, installed military dictatorships in Latin America, and even associated with Nazi movements in the 1940s. The same ones Captain America has fought since his debut. But is there anything interesting in this comic? This Steve Rogers doesn't see himself as evil, but as someone who is restoring order to his country, even if he had to impose a totalitarian regime to do it. The premise of an evil Captain America is very hated, but I think it's worth reading again right now. Recent United States actions have been concerning manipulating governments through tariffs, justifying controversial greetings, and threatening to expel people from their home, both inside and outside their country. Attitudes Captain America would never accept. Is Captain America propaganda or a critique of its government? The answer depends on the context and era of the stories. In his early comics, it could be seen as propaganda. But even in those innocent stories aimed at children, they managed to criticize their country, point out things that were not as good as they could be. As years passed, this critical aspect of the character intensified, becoming the focal point of his stories. Showing that Captain America is not just a soldier who follows orders, but someone who defends like a shield the values that his country should have. And if his comics are so political, what kind of political inclination would Steve Rogers have? My liberal-leaning conservative friend has a valid point. In the comics, while never stated explicitly, it's clear from reading many stories that he defends core values like freedom and justice. But little by little, he realizes that these values are harder to achieve than he thinks. So a large part of his stories have to do with how a man out of his time adapts to a reality that seems to be increasingly complex. In this struggle, he's often disappointed by people's actions and longs for his past. But I think one of the greatest heroic attributes of Steve Rogers is that he has the courage to listen to different points of view and always follow the path he considers most fair. Even if this often means testing his own values. And although his nation doesn't always rise to the occasion. That's why, despite representing a foreign country, he is a character that connects with people from many cultures. Thus, Captain America reminds us that true heroism is not in blind obedience, but in the ability to question and fight to improve the world we live in.